You may hear about the Missouri Senate often, but do you ever wonder what's really going on behind the scenes? All of us here have people at home that we are representing. All of us here have matters that we think are serious for the state of Missouri. So we are trying to do things in an orderly fashion, and we cannot continue to have this chaos. I'm Senate Majority Leader Cindy O'Laughlin, and I'm here to give you that honest view of Missouri politics. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast, Hard Truth with Cindy O'Laughlin. Good afternoon. This is Hard Truth with Cindy O'Laughlin. Thank you for joining me today on our podcast, which we film weekly. The idea of the podcast is that we give you information about what is happening in the Missouri Senate. Sometimes it's not really in a place where someone from the outside can understand all of the inner workings of the Senate. And that is the point of the podcast, that I can give you information and you can understand what we're working on. So this week, we just today, in fact, voted out initiative petition reform. We have talked about that in the past. You met on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, Senator Mary Elizabeth Coleman. This was her bill. And basically, if you're not familiar with the initiative petition process, what we have happening in Missouri is, in general, progressive interests are going out, getting enough signatures to put a measure on the ballot. Out-of-state money comes flooding in the multiple millions, and things are passed that our conservative legislature refuses to pass. And a couple of examples of that would be the expansion of Medicaid. The legislature did not want to pass it. We felt that we've already got quite a commitment, and adding a lot of people to the welfare rolls is really not something that we want to do. We would rather provide an environment where people can prosper on their own, and we'd like to do that by cutting regulations and just making it easier for people to live on their own. So Medicaid expansion was one thing that was passed through the initiative petition. Medical marijuana was passed through that, and also recreational marijuana. So these are all measures that we would not pass through our legislature, and that is how those came to be changes actually in the Missouri Constitution. And that's what the initiative petition process results in, a change to our Constitution. We are interested in protecting the Constitution as much as we can. So we have worked on the initiative petition reform. As I said, this week we passed it out of the Missouri Senate. That's really the first step. It will go to the House, where they will also work on it, and then ultimately it will come back to the Senate. So we're glad that we got through the first step, and we look forward to working with the House members on making it even better through their process. Joining me today is Senator Travis Fitzwater. One of our other priorities in the legislature is trying to do something about personal property tax. I have spoken to you about that before, and we understand that people are really under a lot of financial pressure, and we would like to give them the ability to keep more of their own money and decide how they're going to use it. So Senator Fitzwater, thank you for joining me today. I would like for you to explain what your legislation entails and what we can look forward to.
First of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. This is fun. I think it's a great way to tell our folks what we're doing, what we're up to, and so having that framework for that is excellent. So thanks for doing this. Personal property tax reform. You know, when I knocked doors, when we worked hard to get elected to office, we had a lot of retired folks, a lot of people on fixed incomes, relying on Social Security or some form of low-income retirement program, and that's not growing with the rate of inflation. But personal property tax bills that we receive in December from our local counties, those have grown significantly. And even during COVID, we saw this big jump that was really preposterous. It was really hard for our residents to deal with. If you weren't mad about your personal property tax bill that you got in 2022, then I don't know if you actually looked at it, because it's pretty frustrating to have an old car that goes up in value 25% year over year, and we just needed to fix that. And so that's what we did this week. Thankfully, you brought it up on the floor. We had an initial conversation, kind of figure out what we're up against on the debate on the program. But what we want to do is provide some stability, let Missourians know what they're up against with their property tax bills on a year-to-year basis, give them a relief on their property tax increases, and at the end of the day, ensure that eventually you own your car. You're not forever in perpetuity paying rent to the government to own your car. And so this bill will do all those things, and really excited about moving it forward.
So in the discussion on the Senate floor, there are a few people who have concerns, as usual. And can you tell us what some of those are?
Yeah, so some of it is the length of the depreciation calendar we're setting up. Do you 12 years, do you 15 years? I think it's going to be 12 or 15, somewhere in that space. And the reason for that is the revenues to local counties that go to schools and go to fire and go to police. And how do you ensure that you're not cutting off so much of that? But I think the argument for that is, one, giving residents an understanding of what they're up against in their taxes is the right and fair thing to do. Two, this is the right time to do it because we've seen local counties receiving, in local taxing districts, whether it's your schools or any of these counties and local governments, have seen record revenues the last several years. The state has seen record revenues. So we're collecting revenues as a state on every level at record numbers. And so giving people relief on those on that isn't going to cut services like I think a lot of people think the sky is falling every time you cut a tax. But we just think it's the right thing to do as those swings have occurred so drastically on the upward scale for folks on fixed incomes that can't handle these huge upswings in their tax bills. Right-sizing that and giving them some stability in what they owe on a yearly basis just is the right thing to do.
So sometimes when we have these conversations on the Senate floor, I think about the fact that people always bring up, well, what about your school? What about the roads? What about your ambulance? What about your police? Of course, we think that's important. But I think we also have to remember that our citizens are not seeing an increase in their income, and it's become very difficult for a lot of them just to make ends meet. And sometimes I think our taxing districts might want to take a second look at what they're spending the money on and perhaps try to find a better way to spend the money that doesn't consume as much. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think this argument over who are we fighting for is really pertinent. Are we fighting for government and what's good for government? Or are we fighting for the people and what's good for our people? And I think we've got to make sure the conversation's around what's good for our people first. That should be the first consideration before we're worried about government, their funding. The government's getting a lot of money. I mean, you and I both know we're distributing a lot of money as a state. Local taxing jurisdictions, local counties and municipalities and schools are spending a ton of money. Very seldomly do you ever see these, they're allowed to drop their levies to give tax relief. Very seldomly do you see that locally.
Right.
Because government they just have this endless desire for more money. And so I think to right-size that, not that we shouldn't be, obviously expenses are going up, not that we should be worrying about our police and fire and our schools. You and I have both voted on record levels of funding for all of those things in the state government, but with these huge swings, we've got to give relief to regular Missourians, and I think our battle is for those folks right now, and that's important.
So what are the next steps?
So hopefully we get it perfected. So we laid it over because we needed to have an initial conversation. We had a big week this week. Obviously, you got initiative petition reform through the Senate. Thanks to you on that. Obviously, that's a huge priority for all of us as Republicans. So getting that done was the priority this week. So we had a little bit of time on the back end of this week to start that conversation, and there's a lot of details. We didn't know what we were up against in the Senate to kind of bring the bill to the floor and find out who's interested, who's not, what they want to see done, what questions they have. So having that couple-hour, 3-hour debate on where we're at is really helpful to kind of guide where we go from here. I hope it comes up next week or in the following weeks, and we get a perfection vote and then a third read vote and send it over to the House. I think the House is very interested in this policy too.
So Senator Fitzwater, I want to thank you for being with me today. It always helps to have someone who sponsors the legislation come on the podcast, explain to the people watching I know they're interested. I know that everyone is concerned about taxation, and I just want to thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here.
Thank you to each of you who has watched our podcast this week. Everything that we work on, we have to weigh out the public interest just as a public versus each individual family and their ability to make ends meet, and how what we do affects what they are able to do within their own family. So we're always concerned about that. We look forward to continuing to have a conversation about taxation. And again, thank you for joining us on Hard Truth with Cindy O'Loughlin.